Number 1. Mikhail Popkov. He was a police officer, a husband, a father, the kind of man you'd trust to walk your daughter home at night. And for over 2 decades, he used that trust to become one of the most prolific killers in recorded history. Mikhail Popkov was born in 1964 in Angarsk, a city in the Irkutsk region of Russia. He grew up in what many would describe as an ordinary Soviet household. Nothing about his early years suggested the horror that would follow. He joined the police force in the late 1980s, a role that gave him authority, respect, and most dangerously, access. He married, had a daughter, and by all outward appearances, he was living a normal life. Neighbors described him as quiet, even helpful. He attended parent-teacher meetings. He did his job. He blended in perfectly. But between 1992 and 2010, Mikhail Popkov prowled the streets of Angarsk, Irkutsk, and Vladivostok in his police patrol car. He targeted women, often those walking alone at night, sometimes those who had been drinking, vulnerable, and unlikely to refuse a ride from a uniformed officer. Imagine being a young woman in the dark, seeing a police car pull up beside you, and feeling relief instead of fear. That's the advantage he had. That's the weapon he used. He would offer them a ride. They would get in, and then he would drive them to isolated areas, forests, abandoned roads, places where no one could hear them. What happened next was unspeakable. He would attack them, and then he would kill them. His methods were brutal. He used axes, hammers, screwdrivers, whatever was at hand. The violence was extreme, personal, and relentless. And afterward, he would leave their bodies in the wilderness, sometimes partially hidden, sometimes not. For years, these crimes went unsolved. Authorities struggled to connect the cases. There was no clear pattern at first, no single suspect, and all the while, Popkov continued his double life. The breakthrough came in 2012. Advances in DNA technology allowed investigators to revisit cold cases with fresh eyes. They began testing evidence from unsolved murders dating back decades, and that's when they found a match. The DNA profile from multiple crime scenes pointed to one man, a man who had been hiding in plain sight. Mikhail Popkov was arrested that year, and the investigation that followed was staggering in its scope. Initially, Popkov was charged with a series of murders, but during the interrogation, something unexpected happened. He began to talk, not just about the cases they knew about, but about others, dozens of others. He confessed to crimes that had never been connected, victims whose disappearances had gone unexplained. The list grew longer and longer. Investigators scrambled to verify his claims, cross-referencing dates, locations, and victims. And to their horror, most of what he said checked out. In 2015, Popkov was convicted of 22 murders. He was sentenced to life in prison. But that wasn't the end of the story. Behind bars, he continued to confess. By 2018, he had admitted to 59 additional killings. After a thorough investigation, he was convicted of 56 of those. The number was almost incomprehensible. 83 victims. 83 lives taken over the course of 2 decades. In 2020, he confessed to even more. In 2021, 2 more convictions. In 2023, 3 more. The total kept climbing. During his trial, Popkov showed little emotion. He described his actions in chilling detail, offering explanations that ranged from bizarre to disturbing. He claimed he was targeting women he considered immoral, though investigators noted that many of his victims were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. His justifications were hollow, self-serving, and ultimately meaningless in the face of what he had done. The Russian public was horrified. How had this gone on for so long? How had a police officer, a man tasked with protecting the community, managed to evade capture while committing such a staggering number of crimes? Some pointed to systemic failures in the investigation process during the 1990s and early 2000s. Others noted the lack of resources and coordination between regional police departments. But no explanation could undo the damage. Mikhail Popkov is currently serving a life sentence in a Russian prison. There is no possibility of parole. He will die behind bars. And yet, even now, questions remain. Are there more victims? More confessions waiting to surface? Investigators believe they may never know the full extent of his crimes. Some cases remain unsolved. Some families still have no answers. What makes the Popkov case so deeply unsettling is not just the number of victims, but the nature of the betrayal. This was a man who wore a badge, a man who was supposed to protect. And for 20 years, he used that position to hunt. He understood how to avoid suspicion, how to exploit trust, and how to disappear into the background of everyday life. He was the monster hiding in plain sight. Today, Mikhail Popkov is remembered not just as a criminal, but as a cautionary tale. A reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears a uniform. Sometimes it offers you a ride home. Number 2. Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre. The highway stretched out ahead, quiet and seemingly safe. For motorists traveling through the rural municipalities of Colombia, it was just another journey. But for some, that road became the last one they would ever take. Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre didn't look like a predator. He was a man who blended into the fabric of everyday life in Colombia. Unremarkable, unassuming, the kind of person you might pass on the street without a second glance. But between the late 2000s and 2012, he turned Colombia's roadways into hunting grounds. His targets were travelers, people simply trying to get from one place to another, and his method was as calculated as it was cold. Ramirez Maestre operated in various municipalities, moving between regions to avoid detection. He understood that mobility was his advantage. If he kept moving, kept changing locations, authorities would struggle to connect the dots. And for years, that strategy worked. He would identify vulnerable motorists, those traveling alone, those whose vehicles had broken down, those who needed help. Imagine being stranded on a deserted road, seeing someone approach offering assistance, and feeling grateful. That moment of relief, that brief flash of trust, was exactly what he exploited. The details of his crimes reveal a pattern of deception and violence. He would approach his victims under the guise of offering help or requesting a ride. Once he gained access to their vehicle or lured them to a secondary location, the situation would shift. What began as an innocent interaction would turn deadly. His victims were found in remote areas, their bodies abandoned, their vehicles sometimes stolen or stripped for parts. The motives appeared to vary, sometimes robbery, sometimes something darker, but the outcome was always the same. For years, these incidents were treated as isolated events. Different municipalities, different investigating teams, different jurisdictions. Colombian law enforcement was dealing with high crime rates across multiple regions, and the connection between these roadside killings wasn't immediately obvious. But as the body count grew, patterns began to emerge. Investigators started comparing cases, looking for similarities in method, location, and victim profile. And slowly, a picture began to form. The breakthrough came in 2012. Through a combination of witness testimony, forensic evidence, and surveillance work, authorities identified Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre as a suspect in multiple killings. When they moved in to arrest him, they uncovered evidence that linked him to numerous crimes across different regions. The investigation revealed a trail of victims, each one representing a life cut short, a family left without answers. During questioning, Ramirez Maestre provided information that helped investigators piece together the full scope of his activities. The evidence was damning. Forensic analysis, witness statements, and recovered property all pointed to his involvement in a series of calculated attacks on motorists. The prosecution built their case methodically, presenting evidence that demonstrated not just isolated incidents, but a sustained pattern of predatory behavior. The trial drew significant attention in Colombia. Here was a man who had exploited one of the most universal human experiences, the need to travel, to move from place to place, and turned it into an opportunity for violence. The defense attempted to mitigate the charges, but the evidence was overwhelming. Witness after witness testified. Physical evidence was presented. The connections between the crimes became undeniable. In the end, Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre was convicted and sentenced to 34 years in prison. Under Colombian law, this represented one of the more severe sentences available. He would spend decades behind bars, removed from the highways he had terrorized, unable to prey on unsuspecting travelers any longer. But the story doesn't end with conviction. The families of his victims were left to grapple with an almost unbearable question. Why? What drives someone to target strangers in this way? What goes through a person's mind when they see vulnerability and choose violence instead of compassion? Ramirez Maestre offered no satisfying answers. Like so many before him, his explanations, if he provided any at all, were inadequate in the face of the devastation he caused. The case also highlighted broader issues within Colombia's transportation infrastructure and rural security. How do you protect travelers on isolated roads? How do you warn people about potential dangers without creating a climate of paralyzing fear? These questions lingered long after the trial concluded. Today, Luis Gregorio Ramirez Maestre remains incarcerated, serving his lengthy sentence. The highways he once prowled are still traveled daily by thousands of people. Most of those journeys end safely, uneventfully. But for those who lost loved ones to his violence, every stretch of empty road carries a reminder of what happened. A reminder that predators don't always hide in dark alleys or abandoned buildings. Sometimes they wait by the side of the road, wearing a helpful expression, offering a hand. And by the time you realize the danger, it's already too late. Number 3, Irina Gaidamachuk. She was a neighbor, a familiar face in the community, the kind of woman who might stop to chat about the weather or ask how your day was going. But behind that ordinary exterior was something far darker, something that would earn her one of the most chilling nicknames in Russian criminal history. Irina Gaidamachuk was born in 1972 and lived what appeared to be an unremarkable life in the Sverdlovsk region of Russia. She was married, had children, and like many people in post-Soviet Russia, she struggled financially. Money was tight, bills piled up, and the pressures of everyday life weighed heavily on her shoulders. But millions of people face financial hardship without turning to violence. What set Gaidamachuk apart was the choice she made, and the victims she chose. Between 2002 and 2010, elderly women in the Sverdlovsk region began disappearing or turning up dead in their homes. These were vulnerable people, often living alone, sometimes forgotten by society. They were pensioners, grandmothers, women who had lived through wars and hardships and were simply trying to spend their final years in peace. They trusted their neighbors. They opened their doors to familiar faces. And that trust cost them their lives. Irina Gaidamachuk targeted these women with calculated precision. She would knock on their doors, sometimes under the pretense of needing help or offering assistance. The elderly women, seeing a younger woman who seemed friendly and non-threatening, would let her inside. Once she was in their homes, the facade would drop. She would attack them with whatever was available: hammers, axes, heavy objects, using overwhelming force against victims who had no chance of defending themselves. After taking their lives, she would rob them, stealing money, valuables, jewelry, anything she could sell or pawn to ease her financial troubles. Imagine being one of these women. You've lived 70, 80, maybe 90 years. You've survived so much. And then one day, someone you recognize from the neighborhood asks to come inside, and you say yes because you were raised to be kind, to be helpful. You never imagine that this ordinary Tuesday afternoon will be your last moment alive. The investigation took years to gain momentum. These victims were elderly, often isolated, and their deaths were sometimes initially attributed to natural causes or random burglaries. There was no obvious connection between the cases at first. Different neighborhoods, different dates, different circumstances. But as the body count climbed, investigators began to notice patterns. The victims were all elderly women. The method of attack was similar. Items were always stolen. Someone was systematically targeting the most vulnerable members of society. The breakthrough came through a combination of forensic evidence and witness testimony. Neighbors began recalling seeing a woman in the area around the times of the attacks. Security footage from nearby shops showed Gaidamachuk attempting to sell or pawn items that matched descriptions of stolen property. The net was closing. In 2010, authorities arrested Irina Gaidamachuk, and the interrogation that followed revealed the full horror of what she had done. She confessed to 17 murders. 17 elderly women, each one with a name, a history, a family. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: forensic analysis, stolen property recovered from her possession, witness testimony placing her at or near the crime scenes. The defense had little room to maneuver. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or circumstantial evidence. This was clear, documented, systematic predation. During the trial, the Russian media dubbed her Satan in a skirt, a nickname that reflected the public's horror and disgust at her crimes. Here was a woman who had targeted the most defenseless members of society, not in a moment of passion or desperation, but repeatedly, methodically, over the course of 8 years. The psychological profile that emerged was deeply disturbing. She showed little remorse. She had rationalized her actions as necessary for survival, as if stealing a pensioner's meager savings somehow justified ending their life. In 2012, Irina Gaidamachuk was convicted of multiple counts and sentenced to 20 years in prison. Some felt the sentence was too lenient given the scope of her crimes. Others pointed out that under Russian law, the sentence reflected the available guidelines. Regardless of the debate, one thing was certain: she would spend a significant portion of her remaining life behind bars. The impact of her crimes rippled through communities across the Sverdlovsk region. Elderly residents became more fearful, more isolated, less likely to open their doors even to people they recognized. The social fabric that holds communities together, trust, mutual assistance, basic human decency, had been torn apart. Families of the victims were left with impossible grief, knowing that their mothers and grandmothers had been targeted specifically because of their age and vulnerability. Today, Irina Gaidamachuk remains incarcerated, serving her sentence in a Russian prison. She will likely be an elderly woman herself by the time she is released, if she lives that long. There's a cruel irony in that. The woman who preyed on the elderly will one day experience the same vulnerability she once exploited. Her case stands as a reminder that danger doesn't always come from strangers in masks or shadowy figures in alleys. Sometimes it comes from someone you know, someone from your neighborhood, someone who smiles and asks how you're doing. And sometimes The people society overlooks, the elderly, the isolated, the forgotten, are the ones who need protection the most. Number 4. Bruce McArthur. He was a grandfather, a self-employed landscaper with a gentle demeanor and a friendly smile. He volunteered as a mall Santa during the holidays, bringing joy to children who sat on his lap and whispered their Christmas wishes. To the outside world, Bruce McArthur was a pillar of Toronto's community, reliable, harmless, ordinary. But beneath that carefully maintained exterior was a predator who had been hiding in plain sight for years. Bruce McArthur was born in 1951 in Ontario, Canada. He lived a seemingly conventional life for decades. He married, had children, worked various jobs. But there was always something beneath the surface, something he kept hidden. He eventually came out as a member of the LGBTQ community later in life, a decision that should have marked a new chapter of authenticity and freedom. Instead, it became the backdrop for something far darker. By the 2010s, McArthur had established himself as a landscaper in Toronto, building a client base in some of the city's more affluent neighborhoods. He was known for his meticulous work, his attention to detail, and his quiet, unassuming presence. He also became active in Toronto's gay village, a vibrant community where he could be himself. He dated, socialized, and connected with men through various means, including online platforms where he could meet people discreetly. But what many of these men didn't know was that McArthur had a specific interest in encounters involving restraint and control, and for some, accepting his invitations would be the last decision they ever made. The disappearances began to add up slowly. Men from Toronto's gay village and surrounding areas started vanishing. Skandaraj Navaratnam, Abdul Basir Faizi, Majid Kaihan, Sarush Mahmoodi, Kirishna Kumar Kanagaratnam, Dean Lisowick, Selim Esen, and Andrew Kinsman. These weren't random strangers to the community. They were friends, partners, neighbors. Some were immigrants, some were vulnerable due to housing instability or immigration status, and some were simply living their lives when they crossed paths with McArthur. The community raised alarms. Families reported their loved ones missing. But for years, the cases went unsolved. There were whispers, fears, and a growing sense that something terrible was happening. Yet the investigation struggled to gain traction. What makes McArthur's case particularly chilling is his age. He was 66 years old when he was finally arrested in 2018, one of the oldest known active offenders of his kind. While many criminals begin their violent behavior in their 20s or 30s, McArthur was operating well into his senior years, using his grandfatherly appearance as the perfect cover. Who would suspect the friendly landscaper? Who would imagine that the man trimming hedges and planting flowers was capable of such horror? The truth came to light in January 2018 when Toronto police arrested Bruce McArthur in connection with the disappearance of Andrew Kinsman and Selim Esen. What investigators discovered next was beyond comprehension. They began examining properties where McArthur had worked as a landscaper, places where he had access to gardens, planters, and outdoor spaces. And that's when they started finding remains. Human remains, carefully hidden in large planters on properties throughout the city. McArthur had been using his landscaping work as a cover, literally burying his victims in the gardens of unsuspecting clients. Imagine being a homeowner who had hired this pleasant older man to maintain your property. You trusted him with a key. You let him work unsupervised. You complimented his beautiful planters. And then police arrive at your door to tell you that those planters contain human remains. The psychological impact on these property owners was profound. They had unknowingly provided the burial ground for McArthur's victims. As the investigation deepened, forensic teams uncovered the remains of 8 men. McArthur had kept digital files on his computer, photographs documenting his crimes, images of victims staged in death. The evidence was overwhelming and deeply disturbing. He had lured these men with promises of companionship or encounters, used restraints and control to overpower them, and then taken their lives. Afterward, he dismembered their bodies and disposed of them in various locations, with many ending up in those garden planters. The trial was brief. Faced with insurmountable evidence, Bruce McArthur pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree ending of life in January 2019. The courtroom was filled with family members of the victims, many of whom had waited years for answers. The impact statements were heartbreaking. Parents who had lost sons, siblings who had lost brothers, partners who had lost loved ones. The pain was compounded by the knowledge that some victims had been reported missing years earlier, and the investigation had failed to connect the cases until it was far too late. In February 2019, Bruce McArthur was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole for 25 years. Given his age, this essentially means he will die behind bars. The judge described his crimes as systematic and deliberate, carried out over several years with planning and premeditation. There was no room for leniency, no mitigating factors that could excuse what he had done. The McArthur case sent shockwaves through Toronto and beyond. It raised difficult questions about how the disappearances of marginalized community members, particularly immigrants and members of the LGBTQ community, are investigated. Would the cases have been connected sooner if the victims had been young white women instead of Middle Eastern and South Asian men? The community demanded accountability, and the Toronto Police Service faced intense scrutiny over their handling of the investigation. Today, Bruce McArthur remains in a Canadian federal prison. The properties where he buried his victims have been restored, the planters removed, the gardens replanted. But the scars remain. Families continue to grieve. The community continues to heal. And the image of the friendly grandfather, the jolly Santa, the helpful landscaper has been permanently shattered, replaced by the reality of what he truly was: a predator who used age, respectability, and access to hide his crimes for far too long. Number 5. Filiberto Hernandez Martinez. In the small municipality of Tamuín, located in the state of San Luis Potosí, Mexico, life moved at a slower pace. It was the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, where routines were predictable, and where violence, though not unheard of in a country grappling with cartel activity, still felt like something that happened elsewhere. But between 2010 and 2013, that sense of security was shattered by a man whose actions would leave 6 families devastated and a community forever changed. Filiberto Hernandez Martinez was not a cartel member. He wasn't involved in organized crime or drug trafficking. He was, by most accounts, an ordinary resident of Tamuín, someone who lived among the community, who moved through the same streets and spaces as everyone else. But over the course of 3 years, he became responsible for ending 6 lives, turning this quiet municipality into the backdrop for a series of crimes that would shock the region. The details of his victims and their deaths paint a picture of calculated violence. These weren't random explosions of rage or crimes of passion. They were deliberate acts carried out over an extended period. 6 people, each with their own story, their own family, their own plans for the future, and one by one, those futures were erased. The victims came from the local area, people who likely crossed paths with Hernandez Martinez in their daily lives, perhaps without ever realizing the danger he posed. What drove him to kill remains partially unclear. Unlike cases where financial gain or obvious motive provide some explanation, however inadequate, Hernandez Martinez's crimes seem to stem from something more complex. Some reports suggest personal conflicts. Others hint at disputes that escalated beyond reason. But whatever the trigger, the result was the same. 6 lives lost, 6 families left to pick up the pieces. The investigation into the killings was complicated by several factors. Tamuin is a small municipality, and resources for major criminal investigations were limited. Additionally, Mexico in the early 2010s was experiencing unprecedented levels of violence related to cartel activity. Law enforcement agencies were stretched thin, often prioritizing cases involving organized crime over what might initially appear to be isolated incidents. But as bodies were discovered and the timeline began to take shape, it became clear that these were not unrelated events. Someone in Tamuin was responsible for multiple deaths and that someone needed to be stopped. Local authorities began piecing together evidence, witness statements, forensic analysis, and circumstantial evidence all pointed toward Filiberto Hernandez Martinez. The investigation revealed connections between him and the victims, relationships, encounters, disputes. The puzzle pieces began to fit together. In 2013, authorities moved in to make an arrest. The evidence they had gathered was substantial enough to bring charges, and Hernandez Martinez was taken into custody. The legal proceedings that followed brought some measure of clarity to the case. The prosecution presented their evidence methodically, demonstrating links between the accused and each of the 6 victims. Forensic evidence supported the timeline. Witness testimony corroborated key details. The defense mounted their arguments, but the weight of evidence was significant. This wasn't a case built on speculation or a single piece of questionable proof. This was a case constructed from multiple sources, all pointing to the same conclusion. When the verdict came down, Filiberto Hernandez Martinez was found guilty. The court sentenced him to prison, removing him from the community he had terrorized. Justice, in its legal sense, had been served. But for the families of the 6 victims, the conviction could never truly restore what had been taken. No sentence could bring back a lost son, daughter, parent, or sibling. The courtroom proceedings might have provided answers, but they couldn't provide healing. The impact on Tamuin was profound. In small communities, violence of this nature creates ripples that touch everyone. People who had felt safe walking familiar streets suddenly looked over their shoulders. Trust eroded. The knowledge that someone capable of such acts had been living among them, undetected for years, was deeply unsettling. It challenged the assumption that they knew their neighbors, that they could read people accurately, that their community was immune to this kind of darkness. Today, Filiberto Hernandez Martinez serves his sentence in a Mexican prison. The streets of Tamuin continue their daily rhythms. People go to work, children go to school, life moves forward because it must. But the memory of those 3 years lingers. 6 markers in local cemeteries stand as reminders of lives cut short. 6 families continue to navigate grief that never fully subsides. And a community continues to grapple with the uncomfortable truth that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs. What makes cases like this particularly haunting is their ordinariness. There was no dramatic manhunt, no international intrigue, no sensational media circus. Just a man in a small town making terrible choices, and 6 people paying the ultimate price for those choices. It's a reminder that violence doesn't only occur in major cities or high-profile cases. It happens in small municipalities too, in places where people never expected to see their hometown become associated with such tragedy. The case of Filiberto Hernandez Martinez may not have generated international headlines or inspired documentaries, but for the people of Tamuin, it remains one of the darkest chapters in their community's history. It's a chapter they cannot forget, and one that continues to shape how they understand safety, trust, and the capacity for harm that can exist in even the most familiar faces. Number 6, William Dathan Holbert Paradise. That's what Panama promised to so many American expatriates seeking a new life. Beautiful beaches, lower cost of living, tropical weather, and a fresh start far from the complications of life back home. For some, it was a retirement dream. For others, an adventure. But for those who crossed paths with William Dathan Holbert, paradise became a nightmare they would never escape. William Dathan Holbert, who went by the nickname Wild Bill, was born in upstate New York in 1979. By his 20s, he had already established a pattern of deception and financial schemes. He wasn't a violent criminal at first. He was a con man, someone who used charm and manipulation to separate people from their money. He bounced from place to place, always one step ahead of the consequences, always looking for the next opportunity. And in the mid-2000s, he founded in Panama. Panama had become a hotspot for American retirees and adventurers looking to stretch their retirement savings or start businesses in a tropical setting. The real estate market was booming. Property was relatively cheap. And the expat community was tight-knit, but also trusting. People helped each other out, offered advice, made introductions. It was exactly the kind of environment where someone like Holbert could thrive. He arrived in Panama around 2007 with his girlfriend, Laura Michelle Reese, and immediately began working his charm. Holbert presented himself as a successful businessman and property investor. He was friendly, outgoing, always ready with a story about his latest venture. He and Reese established themselves in Bocas del Toro, a popular expat destination known for its laid-back atmosphere and stunning natural beauty. They appeared to be living the dream, running properties, meeting people, becoming part of the community. But beneath that surface, Holbert was operating a scheme far more sinister than simple fraud. Between 2007 and 2010, 5 Americans disappeared in Panama. These weren't random tourists. They were expats, people who had moved to Panama permanently, who had property and assets. Cher Hughes and her boyfriend Michael Brown vanished. Bo Eislar, a marine surveyor, disappeared. William Cortez and his wife Jane went missing. These were people with connections, with friends who noticed when they stopped showing up, with families back in the United States who expected regular contact. And when that contact ceased, questions began to arise. The answer to those questions was buried on William Holbert's property, literally. Holbert had developed a pattern that was as calculating as it was cruel. He would befriend wealthy expats, gain their trust, learn about their assets and property holdings. Then, he would lure them to isolated locations with promises of business deals or property viewings. Once there, he would attack them, ending their lives and taking everything they owned. He would forge documents, assume control of their properties, drain their bank accounts, and essentially steal their entire lives. And to cover his tracks, he buried their bodies on land he controlled. Imagine moving to paradise, befriending someone who seems helpful and knowledgeable about the area, agreeing to meet them to discuss a property investment, and never being seen again. Your family back home receives a few emails, supposedly from you, saying everything is fine, you're just busy with the move. But those emails aren't from you. They're from the person who buried you in the jungle and is now systematically looting your life savings. The investigation began to intensify in 2010. Multiple missing persons reports, combined with irregularities in property transfers and financial transactions, pointed investigators toward Holbert and Reese. Panamanian authorities, working with U.S. law enforcement, began surveillance. They discovered that Holbert had been using forged documents and false identities. Financial records showed suspicious transfers from the accounts of missing persons. The evidence was building, but they needed something concrete. In July 2010, William Holbert and Laura Reese were arrested in Nicaragua, where they had fled after sensing the investigation was closing in. They were extradited back to Panama, and the search of Holbert's property began. What investigators found confirmed their worst fears. Buried in shallow graves across the property were the remains of 5 people, the missing Americans whose disappearances had sparked the investigation. The forensic evidence was damning. These people had been deliberately targeted, eliminated, and disposed of like trash. During interrogation, the full scope of the scheme emerged. Holbert had been running an operation designed to identify wealthy expats with assets, befriend them, gain access to their financial information, and then eliminate them to take control of everything they owned. It was premeditated financial gain taken to its most extreme and horrifying conclusion. Reese, his girlfriend, had been complicit, helping to maintain the facade, assisting with the forgeries, and participating in the cover-up. The trial in Panama drew international attention. Here was an American who had come to a country offering him opportunity and freedom, and he had repaid that hospitality by preying on his own fellow citizens. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: forensic analysis of the remains, financial records showing fraudulent transfers, forged documents, witness testimony from people who had interacted with Holbert and the victims. The defense had virtually no room to maneuver. In 2013, William Dathan Holbert was convicted of multiple counts and sentenced to 47 years in prison. Laura Michelle Reese received 26 years. Under Panamanian law, these were severe sentences that ensured both would spend the majority of their remaining lives behind bars. For the families of the victims, the convictions brought some closure, but the pain remained overwhelming. Their loved ones had moved to Panama full of hope and excitement, and they had been betrayed in the worst possible way. The impact on Panama's expat community was devastating. Trust, which had been the foundation of that community's warmth and openness, was shattered. People became more cautious, more suspicious, more protective of their information and assets. The real estate market, which had thrived on word-of-mouth recommendations and personal connections, became more formal and guarded. The dream of paradise had been tainted by the reality that predators exist everywhere, even in the most beautiful settings. Today, William Dathan Holbert sits in a Panamanian prison, his nickname Wild Bill now associated not with adventure, but with calculated violence. The properties he stole have been returned to the victims' estates. The land where he buried his victims has been excavated and cleared. But the scars remain on the families who lost loved ones, on the community that was violated, and on the very idea that paradise could ever be a place of complete safety and trust. Number 7. Jean Villadilme. The nursing home should be a place of peace, a place where the elderly can spend their final years with dignity, surrounded by care and compassion. Families entrust their most vulnerable loved ones to these facilities, believing they will be safe, comfortable, and treated with respect. But in Olot, a town in Catalonia, Spain, that trust was betrayed in the most unthinkable way, by someone whose job was to provide care. Jean Villadilme was a nursing assistant who worked at a residential care facility in Olot. Born in 1963, he had spent years in the healthcare field, a profession that requires patience, empathy, and a genuine desire to help those who cannot help themselves. On the surface, he appeared to be exactly that kind of caregiver. He showed up for his shifts, interacted with residents, and performed his duties. But between 2009 and 2010, something dark was happening behind closed doors, something that would eventually reveal him as one of the most disturbing figures in Spanish criminal history. Elderly residents at the nursing home began dying under circumstances that seemed, at first, unremarkable. They were old, many had underlying health conditions, and death in a facility like this was not uncommon. But as the number of deaths increased, staff members began to notice patterns. Some residents deteriorated rapidly and unexpectedly. Others showed signs of distress or illness that didn't align with their documented conditions. Medical professionals raised concerns, and eventually, those concerns reached authorities who ordered a deeper investigation. What they discovered was horrifying. Joan Villadilme had been deliberately poisoning residents under his care, not all at once, but systematically, over an extended period. He used various substances, medications administered in fatal doses, and in at least 3 cases, caustic cleaning materials. Imagine the agony of those final moments. Elderly individuals, already frail and vulnerable, experiencing excruciating pain as corrosive chemicals burned through their throats and digestive systems. The suffering would have been immense, prolonged, and terrifying. These were not quick, peaceful passes. They were slow, agonizing deaths. Investigators eventually connected Villadilme to at least 11 confirmed deaths, though there were suspicions the actual number could be higher. The challenge with cases in nursing homes is that death is expected, and unless there's an obvious reason to investigate, many passings are attributed to natural causes. How many others might have been his victims? How many families buried their loved ones never knowing the truth? These questions haunted the investigation. When authorities arrested Villadilme in 2010, the evidence against him was substantial. Toxicology reports from exhumed bodies revealed the presence of substances that had no medical justification. Patterns in shift assignments showed that deaths clustered around times when he was working. Witness statements from other staff members described suspicious behavior. Villadilme administering medications that hadn't been prescribed, being present in rooms alone with residents who later deteriorated rapidly, disposing of materials in unusual ways. During the trial, Villadilme made a claim that added another layer of complexity to an already disturbing case. He insisted that his actions had been mercy killings, that he had been ending the suffering of residents who were in pain, who had poor quality of life, who would have wanted release from their circumstances. He portrayed himself as someone motivated by compassion, not malice. He claimed he was sparing them from further suffering, but the prosecution dismantled this defense methodically. First, there was the matter of consent. None of these residents had requested assistance in ending their lives. None had expressed wishes to die. Villadilme had made these decisions unilaterally, without consultation with the residents, their families, or medical professionals. He had appointed himself judge and executioner, deciding whose life was worth continuing and whose was not. Second, there was the method. If his goal had truly been to end suffering peacefully, why would he use caustic cleaning materials in 3 cases? These substances cause chemical burns, intense pain, and a prolonged agonizing death. There is nothing merciful about forcing someone to drink drain cleaner. The choice of method revealed something far darker than compassion. It suggested cruelty, a desire to cause harm, or at minimum, a complete disregard for the suffering he was inflicting. Third, medical evaluations of the victims showed that many were not terminally ill or in unbearable pain. Some had manageable conditions. Some were relatively stable. Villadilme's characterization of them as suffering beyond help was contradicted by their actual medical records. He had fabricated or exaggerated their conditions to justify his actions after the fact. The trial gripped Spain. Here was a healthcare worker, someone society depends on to protect the vulnerable, who had instead become a serial killer operating in plain sight. The elderly residents he targeted were among the most defenseless members of society, people with limited mobility, cognitive impairments in some cases, and no ability to defend themselves or report abuse. They were entirely at his mercy, and he had shown them none. In 2012, Jean Villadilme was convicted of multiple counts and sentenced to 127 years in prison. Under Spanish law, the maximum time actually served is typically much less, but the lengthy sentence reflected the severity and number of his crimes. He was removed from society, barred from ever working in healthcare again, and labeled as what he truly was, a predator who had exploited the most vulnerable. The nursing home where the crimes occurred faced intense scrutiny. How had this gone undetected for so long? What oversight failures had allowed a staff member to poison residents repeatedly without being caught? The case prompted widespread reforms in how nursing homes in Spain monitor medication administration, how deaths are investigated, and how staff are supervised. Families demanded accountability, and the facility faced both legal consequences and the permanent stain of association with such horrific crimes. For the families of the victims, the revelation was devastating. They had placed their loved ones in that facility believing they would be cared for. Instead, those loved ones had been deliberately harmed by the very person supposed to protect them. The grief was compounded by guilt. Should they have visited more often? Should they have noticed something? Could they have prevented this? These questions, though ultimately unfair to ask of themselves, haunted them nonetheless. Today, Jean Villadilme remains in prison. The nursing home has implemented new protocols and safeguards. The town of Olot continues to grapple with the knowledge that such evil existed in their community, in a place meant to provide comfort in life's final chapter. And across Spain, the case stands as a dark reminder that vulnerability creates opportunity for those with malicious intent, and that society must remain vigilant in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. The truly chilling aspect of this case is how easily it could have continued. If not for observant staff members who noticed patterns and had the courage to speak up, how many more elderly residents might have suffered? How long would Villadilme have continued operating under the guise of mercy? It's a question with no answer, but one that underscores the importance of oversight, accountability, and the courage to question authority when something doesn't feel right. Number 8. Daniel Wozniak. The theater is a place of illusion. Actors step onto the stage, become different people, tell stories that captivate audiences, and then take their bows as the curtain falls. But for Daniel Wozniak, a community theater actor in Costa Mesa, California, the performance didn't end when he left the stage. He was playing a role in real life too, the role of a friendly, struggling actor just trying to make ends meet. And that performance would lead to two people losing their lives in one of the most calculated and cold-blooded crimes Southern California had seen in years. Daniel Wozniak was born in 1984 and grew up with dreams of making it in the entertainment industry. By his late 20s, he was performing in community theater productions in Orange County, taking whatever roles he could get, working odd jobs to pay the bills. He wasn't a star, but he was passionate about acting, and he had managed to carve out a life in the local theater scene. In 2010, he was engaged to be married to his girlfriend, Rachel Buffett. They were planning their wedding, dreaming about their honeymoon, making all the arrangements that young couples make when they're about to start their lives together. But there was a problem, a significant problem. Money. The wedding and honeymoon were expensive, and Wozniak didn't have the funds to cover it all. Living in the same apartment complex as Wozniak was Samuel Herr, a 26-year-old Army veteran who had served in Afghanistan. Sam, as friends called him, had just returned from deployment and was readjusting to civilian life. He was a kind person, well-liked, and most importantly, for what would come next, he had savings, combat pay he had earned during his service. He trusted his neighbor Daniel. They were friendly. They talked. There was no reason for Sam to suspect that the actor next door was looking at him and seeing not a friend, but an opportunity. On May 21, 2010, Daniel Wozniak lured Sam Herr to the Huntington Beach Community Theater, where he performed, under the pretense of helping with some production work. The theater was largely empty that day. Once Sam was there, in a secluded area backstage, Wozniak attacked him. He ended Sam's life, then methodically dismembered his body in an attempt to conceal the crime and make identification more difficult. He took Sam's wallet, his bank cards, his personal information, everything he needed to access Sam's accounts. But the violence didn't end there. Sam had a friend, Julie Kibwishi, a 23-year-old college student and tutor. After taking Sam's life, Wozniak used Sam's phone to text Julie, asking her to come to Sam's apartment. When she arrived, expecting to see her friend, she instead encountered Daniel Wozniak. He ended her life too, shooting her and staging the scene to make it appear as though Sam had committed the crime before disappearing. It was a calculated attempt to frame a dead man, to create a false narrative that would direct suspicion away from himself. Imagine being Julie's parents. Your daughter goes to help a friend and never comes home. Then you learn she's been found deceased in that friend's apartment, and the initial theory is that the friend, someone you trusted, someone your daughter trusted, might be responsible. The pain is compounded by confusion and betrayal. Except Sam wasn't responsible. Sam was a victim too, his body hidden, his reputation being destroyed posthumously by the real perpetrator. In the days following the crimes, Daniel Wozniak went about his life with chilling normalcy. He accessed Sam's bank accounts using the stolen information, withdrawing cash to fund his wedding and honeymoon plans. He attended his bachelor party. He performed in a theater production, ironically, a musical called Nine, where he sang and danced just days after committing double homicide. He smiled. He laughed. He played his part. But investigators were already closing in. The Orange County Sheriff's Department quickly identified inconsistencies in the crime scene. Staging. The forensic evidence didn't support the narrative that Sam had taken Julie's life. The timeline didn't work. The motive didn't make sense. And when they pulled financial records, they discovered that someone had been accessing Sam's accounts after his disappearance. Someone who was withdrawing money at ATMs captured on surveillance cameras. That someone was Daniel Wozniak. Within days of the crimes, authorities arrested Wozniak. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Surveillance footage of him using Sam's ATM card, forensic evidence linking him to both crime scenes, digital records of the text messages he had sent from Sam's phone to lure Julie to her death, and eventually, his own confessions during interrogation. The theater of his everyday performance had come crashing down. The trial didn't begin until 2016, 6 years after the crimes. The prosecution presented a case built on meticulous evidence and a clear motive: greed. Wozniak had needed money for his wedding and honeymoon, had known that Sam had combat pay saved up, and had made the calculated decision that Sam's life was worth less than his own financial convenience. The murder of Julie was an attempt to cover up the first crime and create a false trail. Both killings were premeditated, planned, and executed with shocking callousness. The defense attempted to argue for a lesser sentence, suggesting that Wozniak hadn't planned to take anyone's life, that things had spiraled out of control. But the evidence contradicted this narrative at every turn. The dismemberment of Sam's body showed planning and deliberation. The staging of Julie's scene showed calculation. The continued withdrawals from Sam's account showed a complete lack of remorse. This wasn't a crime of passion or a situation that got out of hand. This was cold, calculated violence in pursuit of money. In September 2016, the jury found Daniel Wozniak guilty on 2 counts of first-degree ending of life, along with special circumstances that made him eligible for the most severe sentence available. In 2019, after additional proceedings, he was formally sentenced to passing by judicial means. He currently sits on the appropriate housing unit in California, his appeals ongoing, his wedding and honeymoon long forgotten in the wake of the devastation he caused. Rachel Buffett, his fiancée, was also arrested and charged with accessory after the fact. Prosecutors alleged she had helped Wozniak after the crimes and had lied to investigators. She accepted a plea deal and served time in prison before being released. Whether she knew the full extent of what Wozniak had done remains a matter of debate, but her involvement added another layer of tragedy to an already horrific case. For the families of Sam Herr and Julie Kibuishi, the trial brought some measure of justice, but it could never restore what was taken. Sam, a veteran who had survived combat in Afghanistan, came home only to be taken by someone he considered a neighbor and friend. Julie, a bright young woman with her whole life ahead of her, was in the wrong place at the wrong time, a witness eliminated to protect a lie. Both families have worked to keep their loved ones' memories alive, establishing scholarships and memorials, ensuring that Sam and Julie are remembered for who they were, not just how they died. The case of Daniel Wozniak is particularly chilling because of how ordinary he seemed. He wasn't a career criminal or someone with a history of violence. He was a community theater actor, someone people knew and liked. But when faced with a financial problem, he didn't choose to work harder, to scale back his plans, or to ask for help. He chose violence. He chose to value money over human life. And in doing so, he destroyed not just 2 lives, but countless others, families, friends, a community that had trusted him. Today, the theater where some of these crimes occurred still stands. Productions continue. Actors still take the stage. But for those who remember May 2010, there's always a shadow over that space, a reminder that sometimes the most convincing performances happen off stage, and sometimes the person taking a bow is hiding something far darker than anyone in the audience could imagine. Number 9. Stephen Sean Griffiths. He called himself the Crossbow Cannibal. It wasn't a nickname given by the media or investigators. It was a title he chose for himself, a grotesque branding of his own crimes. Stephen Sean Griffiths was a man obsessed with violent offenders, someone who had spent years studying their methods, their psychology, their patterns. He was pursuing a PhD in criminology, researching historical cases of extreme violence. But somewhere along the way, the line between academic interest and personal obsession blurred, and Griffiths stopped being a researcher and became the subject he had been studying. Stephen Griffiths was born in 1969 in Dewsbury, West Yorkshire, England. His childhood was troubled, marked by behavioral issues, early signs of psychological disturbance, and a fascination with violence that manifested at a young age. By his teens, he had already had encounters with mental health services, but he was also intelligent, academically capable, and eventually found his way into higher education. He enrolled at the University of Bradford to pursue graduate studies in criminology, focusing specifically on historical cases of those who had taken multiple lives. His thesis research was extensive, detailed, and deeply unsettling to those who supervised his work. He immersed himself in the darkest corners of criminal history, and that immersion would eventually consume him entirely. By 2009, Griffiths was living in a flat in Bradford, West Yorkshire. He kept to himself mostly, a solitary figure known to neighbors as odd, but not necessarily dangerous. He had a collection of weapons in his apartment, including crossbows, which he claimed were part of his research or personal interest. He also had surveillance equipment, cameras that monitored the hallways and entrance of his building. On the surface, it might have seemed like paranoia or eccentricity. In reality, those cameras would eventually capture evidence that would seal his fate. Griffiths' victims were vulnerable women, individuals involved in certain street-based activities, people who were marginalized, often overlooked by society, and whose disappearances might not immediately trigger major investigations. Susan Rushworth disappeared in June 2009. She was last seen in the Thornton Road area of Bradford, a location known for street-based activities. Her body was never found. For months, her disappearance remained unsolved, her fate unknown to her family and friends. Then, in April and May 2010, 2 more women vanished. Shelley Armitage was last seen on April 26th. Suzanne Blamiers disappeared on May 21st. Both women were from the same vulnerable community. Both had connections to the same area of Bradford, and both had crossed paths with Stephen Griffiths. Unlike Susan Rushworth, however, the disappearance of Suzanne Blamiers would lead directly to Griffiths' capture, because this time he had made a critical mistake. On May 21st, surveillance cameras in Griffiths' apartment building recorded something horrifying. The footage showed Suzanne Blamiers entering the building with Griffiths. Later, it captured Griffiths dragging what appeared to be a body, wrapped and concealed, out of his apartment. The building's caretaker, reviewing the footage for unrelated reasons, saw the images and immediately contacted police. What they were seeing couldn't be explained away as anything innocent. This was evidence of something terrible. Police arrived at Griffiths' apartment on May 24, 2010. When they entered, they found a scene that would haunt the investigating officers for the rest of their lives. There was evidence of dismemberment, remains, and disturbing materials related to his crimes. Griffiths had kept body parts in his apartment. The forensic examination revealed traces of all 3 victims, Susan, Shelley, and Suzanne. He had not only taken their lives, but had dismembered them afterward, disposing of parts in various locations around Bradford. Some remains were found in the River Aire, others in different waterways. Some never recovered at all. When police arrested Griffiths, he showed no remorse. In fact, he seemed almost proud. During his first court appearance, when asked to state his name, he responded, "The Crossbow Cannibal." It was a moment that chilled everyone in the courtroom. He wasn't trying to deny what he had done or minimize his actions. He was embracing them, owning them, turning them into an identity. It was the response of someone who had crossed a line so completely that there was no humanity left, only a fascination with his own notoriety. The investigation revealed the full extent of his obsession. His apartment contained extensive research materials on historical cases involving extreme violence and acts related to consuming human remains. He had studied these cases not as cautionary tales or psychological curiosities, but as inspiration. He had weapons, including the crossbow that gave him part of his self-chosen nickname. And he had acted out the very crimes he had spent years researching, turning academic knowledge into practical application in the most horrific way imaginable. The trial was mercifully brief. Faced with overwhelming evidence, the surveillance footage, the forensic findings, the materials in his apartment, Griffiths pleaded guilty to all 3 counts in December 2010. There was no point in mounting a defense. The evidence was irrefutable, and his own words had already condemned him. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment with a whole life order, meaning he would never be eligible for parole. He would die in prison, removed from society permanently. The psychological profile that emerged during the case was deeply disturbing. Griffiths exhibited characteristics of severe personality disorders, extreme narcissism, and a complete lack of empathy. His academic work had provided him with a framework for understanding violence, but instead of using that knowledge to prevent harm or help others, he had used it to refine his own methods. He had studied the mistakes of historical offenders and tried to avoid making those same errors. He had approached taking lives the way a student approaches a thesis, with research, planning, and methodology. For the families of Susan Rushworth, Shelley Armitage, and Suzanne Blamiers, the trial brought some answers, but also profound pain. These women had been failed by society long before they encountered Griffiths. They were vulnerable, marginalized, and in circumstances that made them easy targets. Their disappearances hadn't immediately triggered the kind of massive investigation that might have saved subsequent victims. And when their remains were found, or in Susan's case, never fully recovered, the families were left to grieve not just the loss, but the manner of it, the degradation their loved ones had suffered. The case also raised difficult questions about academic research into violent crime. Griffiths had been allowed to pursue increasingly disturbing research topics, to immerse himself in materials that detailed extreme violence, and to develop what some supervisors had described as an unhealthy fixation. Should there have been more oversight? Should mental health concerns have been addressed more aggressively? Could someone have intervened before his research became a rehearsal? These questions don't have easy answers, but they linger nonetheless. Today, Stephen Sean Griffiths remains in a maximum security prison in England. He has made statements over the years claiming responsibility for even more victims, though investigators have not been able to verify these claims. Whether he's telling the truth or simply seeking attention is unclear. What is clear is that he represents one of the most disturbing cases in recent British criminal history, not just because of what he did, but because of who he was. An educated man, a researcher, someone who understood the psychology of violence intimately and chose to embody it anyway. Bradford has moved forward, but the shadow of those months in 2009 and 2010 remains. The areas where the victims were last seen are still traveled, still inhabited, still part of the city's landscape. But for those who remember, there's always an awareness, a knowledge that someone was hunting in those streets, studying his prey, and acting out a script he had written for himself after years of research. The Crossbow Cannibal was a title Stephen Griffiths gave himself, a grotesque attempt at notoriety. But history will remember him not as the character he tried to create, but as what he truly was, a predator who used intelligence and education not to help society, but to harm its most vulnerable members. Number 10. Bakuni. In Indonesia, childhood should be a time of innocence, play, and safety. Parents send their children to school, to play with friends, to explore their neighborhoods, trusting that their communities will protect them. But in certain areas of Indonesia, during the early 2010s, that trust was violated in the most horrific way possible by a man whose name would become synonymous with unthinkable crimes against the most innocent members of society. Bakuni was not a stranger lurking in the shadows. He was part of the community, someone who moved through everyday spaces without raising immediate alarm. But beneath that ordinary exterior was a predator who targeted young boys, children who should have been safe, who should have been protected, who instead became victims of violence that would end their lives and devastate their families. The exact number of his victims has been difficult to establish with certainty, but what is known is that multiple young boys fell prey to his actions over a period of time before authorities finally connected the cases. Indonesia is a vast archipelago nation with over 17,000 islands, hundreds of ethnic groups, and a population exceeding 270 million people. Law enforcement resources are stretched across enormous distances, and coordination between regional police departments can be challenging. In rural or less developed areas, crimes, especially those involving vulnerable populations, can sometimes go undetected or uninvestigated for longer than they would in urban centers with more resources. This reality created an environment where someone like Baikuni could operate with terrible effectiveness. The pattern of his crimes revealed a calculated approach. He targeted young boys, often from families with limited resources or in situations where the children had less supervision. These were kids who might be playing outside unsupervised, walking home from school alone, or in circumstances where a trusted adult figure could easily gain access to them. The vulnerability of children is universal, but in contexts where poverty, lack of resources, or social instability exist, that vulnerability is amplified. Baikuni exploited every aspect of that vulnerability. The details of what he did to these children are too disturbing to recount in full, but what must be understood is that his crimes involved not just violence, but systematic harm of the worst kind. These were not impulsive acts, but deliberate, repeated offenses against children who had no ability to protect themselves or understand what was happening to them. And when he was finished, he took their lives, ending any possibility that they could identify him, testify against him, or escape to tell what had happened. The investigation into these crimes was complex and emotionally devastating for everyone involved. When children disappear or are found deceased in circumstances suggesting foul play, entire communities are traumatized. Parents become terrified to let their children out of sight. Schools implement new safety protocols. The social fabric of trust begins to fray. And for investigators, these cases carry a particular weight. There's an urgency, a moral imperative to find whoever is responsible and stop them before more children are harmed. Evidence began to accumulate, linking Baikuni to multiple victims. Witness statements placed him near locations where children had disappeared. Forensic evidence connected him to crime scenes. Patterns in the timing and nature of the offenses suggested a single perpetrator rather than isolated incidents. Indonesian authorities built their case methodically, knowing that the charges they would bring carried the most severe consequences available under law. When Baikuni was arrested, the communities affected experienced a mixture of relief and rage. Relief that the person responsible had been caught, that no more children would fall victim to him, but also rage at what he had done, at how long it had taken to stop him, at the lives destroyed and the innocents shattered. In cases involving crimes against children, public emotion runs especially high. There's a universal recognition that children represent the future, that they are meant to be protected by adults, and that anyone who violates that sacred responsibility has committed something beyond ordinary crime. The legal proceedings moved forward with the full weight of Indonesian law behind them. The prosecution presented evidence demonstrating not just individual acts but a pattern of predatory behavior targeting the most vulnerable members of society. The defense had little room to maneuver when faced with forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the overwhelming factual record of what had occurred. This wasn't a case where innocence could be credibly argued or where circumstances could be used to mitigate responsibility. Initially, Baikuni was sentenced to life imprisonment. In the Indonesian legal system, this represented one of the most severe sentences available. He would be removed from society permanently, locked away where he could never harm another child. But for many, including the families of his victims and members of the communities he had terrorized, life imprisonment didn't seem sufficient. These crimes were so heinous, so utterly beyond the bounds of acceptable human behavior, that the maximum punishment available felt inadequate. The case underwent appeal and review processes. Indonesian law allows for capital punishment in cases involving particularly severe crimes, especially those involving violence against children. After additional legal proceedings and considerations, the sentence was changed from life imprisonment to a sentence of judicial end of life. This represented a determination by the Indonesian legal system that Baikuni's crimes warranted the ultimate penalty, that his actions had been so devastating, so irredeemable, that execution was the appropriate response. The decision sparked broader discussions within Indonesia about justice, punishment, and the protection of children. Indonesia has ongoing debates about its legal system, capital punishment, and how best to address crimes against vulnerable populations. Some view the sentence as appropriate justice for unspeakable crimes. Others question the effectiveness of such penalties as deterrents or express concerns about the judicial process. These are complex moral and legal questions without easy answers. What cannot be debated is the impact on the victims' families. Parents who lost children to Baikuni's violence live with grief that never fully subsides. Siblings grow up without brothers they should have had. Communities remain scarred by the knowledge of what happened in their midst. No sentence, regardless of severity, can restore what was taken. No punishment can bring back a child or undo the trauma inflicted on families and communities. Today, Baikuni awaits his sentence in an Indonesian prison. The legal process continues through various stages of appeal and review, as is standard in cases involving such severe penalties. The children he harmed are remembered by their families, not primarily as victims, but as the sons, brothers, friends, and students they were before their lives were cut short. Their names, their faces, their potential, all of that lives on in the memories of those who loved them. The case serves as a stark reminder of the ongoing need to protect children, to create systems and communities where vulnerability cannot be so easily exploited, and to remain vigilant against those who would harm the innocent. In Indonesia and around the world, crimes against children provoke universal outrage because they represent a violation of the most fundamental human responsibility: the protection of those too young to protect themselves. For the communities affected by Baikuni's crimes, healing is not a linear process. It's measured in small steps, in children who grow up safe, in parents who slowly rebuild trust, in communities that refuse to let fear define them. The shadow of what happened remains, but so does the resilience of people who choose to move forward, to remember the victims, and to work toward ensuring that such horrors are not repeated.